Welcome. My name is Ashante Horton. I'm the NCSS Conference Services and Education Manager. Tonight's presentation, Putting It into Practice, Classroom Case Studies and Lesson Plans about Religious Diversity, is the last of a four-part Religion, Social Studies, and You webinar series that was put together with the help of Morley Balaji with the Hindu American Foundation, Kristen Looney with Tony Blair's Face to Faith, Charles Haynes with the Religious Freedom Center of the Museum Institute, and Mark Fowler of Tanenbaum through the sponsorship of the Nissan Foundation. At this time, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Morley Balaji to get the webinar started.
Thank you so much, Ashante. This has been probably one of the most illuminating webinars I have ever participated in, and I hope those of you who are in attendance have really been able to apply these concepts, digest them, and really look at ways you can incorporate them into your own teaching approaches. With that being said, this final session is going to involve really how you take it home. And Mark Fowler is going to illustrate all the concepts that we've gone through these past three sessions have an end goal, and that is really improving your pedagogy. And so without any further delay, I'd like to hand it.
Thanks so much, Morley, and good evening, everyone. Welcome to this last session of our webinar series, Religion, Social Studies, and You. It has been a great pleasure for us to work with all of the partners, with the Hindu American Foundation, the National Council for the Social Studies, Face to Faith of the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, and the First Amendment Center, the Museum Institute. So we're just very excited that this has all come to be, and glad to be with you again this evening. Just a quick word for those of you who are joining us tonight but may not be familiar with Tanenbaum. We are a secular, non-sectarian, not-for-profit based in New York City. Our mission is to combat religious prejudice, and we do that through creating practical programs that allow for, in this instance, educators from a variety of circumstances, whether it's public school or private school, independent schools, or even after-school programs, to have the tools and the training that they need to address religion as an aspect of identity within multiculturalism, but certainly looking to create inclusive educational environments where young people can thrive. We also want to acknowledge the Nissan Foundation for supporting Tanenbaum's participation in this webinar series. In terms of our objectives for this evening, we want to talk a little bit in the first objective and share some strategies with you for making decisions about the use of textbooks and curricula in your classrooms. And we know that some of this is not completely up to you, but we do want to hopefully shine some light on some ways that you can augment if you're presented with information. And certainly if you have the good fortune to be able to create your own curricula, some things that may hopefully guide some of your decisions. In the second objective, we'll do a little work around some modeling for addressing those moments that are likely to happen, may have already happened to you, or will happen at some point in your career when the exploration of religion and/or religious identity enters the classroom, and how best to respond. And then finally, we want to introduce some ideas really for your consideration that could possibly increase the different topic areas where religion and religious identity could be introduced to your students, or perhaps some new thoughts about ways in which those ideas could be expressed. So with that, we'll go ahead and start with the section on curricula and textbooks. And I would say that, so we're going to start with the chat feature. And this is our way of communicating with one another. And I'd ask the question, what is the most inaccurate bit of information you've come across regarding religion in a textbook? Okay, so any text that says some group of people believe, or those that don't take on an objective standpoint, I don't know if I can think of any inaccurate as much as really broad generalizations. Okay, that's fair. And that's an interesting point, actually. We'll get back to that in terms of generalizations. Let me go on to the next question. 'Cause I think that may help to drill it down a little bit more. So, what's the most misleading curriculum you've come across regarding teaching about religion? Okay, Matthew, thank you for your response on the last question about the absence of religion in textbooks and no detail, particularly with the example of Malcolm X and being able to discuss the Nation of Islam, his post Hajj experience, which is really critical to speaking about his work and the civil rights movement to a degree. Most misleading curriculum you've come across regarding teaching about religion. It may be a curriculum that you were provided by the superintendency or the State Department of Education in the state in which you work. It might be something more local. Okay, so it's more coverage of Western religions and more depth than with Eastern traditions. Okay, general avoidance of religious context in historical movements and events. Hinduism being presented as being polytheistic. Thank you, Joanne. We got your message. Okay, these are all really great. And what I'd like to do is let me move on and just reintroduce to those of you who were on the last webinar and introduce to you to those of you who are joining us tonight, two of the principles from our pedagogy, the 7 principles for inclusive education, as a way of thinking about some different avenues, perhaps, in terms of dealing with curricula and textbooks in classrooms. So our principle of choosing appropriate materials has a great deal to do with having multiple pictures, voices, sources, and readings about different groups of people. And I'm going to give you some examples of what I mean by that in a moment. Using primary sources are really, as I think we all know, far more useful, but they're used, and we can use secondary sources in many instances, but they're really used best if you have primary sources and not secondary sources as a stand-in for primary. And then also in terms of images and what do students actually see in addition to the words that they're reading. Because one of the things that we know is that societies and cultures are constantly changing, and people may often appear very differently over a period of time, certainly from a particular moment in time to where we find them now. So it's just important to be able to have a variety of images that don't present any group of people that are still living and participating in a global society as locked in one moment in time. And with adapting and integrating lessons appropriately, one of the things that we recognized a long time ago at Tanenbaum was that anything that we created is, yes, our best thinking, but it doesn't mean that all of it is completely applicable in your classroom. So we really do work with educators to take what we've created and make it their own and use it in ways that make sense within their classrooms and within the social context that they find themselves. When we're talking about this particular principle, one of the ideas that becomes very important is um, showing representations from a variety of perspectives, but considering your audience becomes very important. So, who are the students who are in front of you? What are the various experiences that they've had that you know about, and what experiences might they have had that you couldn't possibly know about because it hasn't come up? This principle also has to do with the assumptions we bring into our classrooms with our students and being mindful of the interaction between a student's family history and the topic that you may be interacting with. We were working with an after school program in Bed-Stuy. They were using our World Olympics curriculum. And one of the countries that they chose to include was Italy. And no one had actually asked these two students, a pair of siblings, who were in the program, but apparently they were born in Italy. Now, here are these two appearingly African American students from Bed-Stuy who no one knew spoke fluent Italian. and that their father, I believed, or one of their parents was in the armed forces, and they were actually born and raised for the first part of their life in Italy. So it's those kinds of things that can come up, that can be a part of adapting and integrating lessons appropriately. So let me go on to this next point. And I love this, with what Matthew, what you shared about the distinction between history texts and social science texts, and the different perspectives with which they view religion. The social science texts present religion from an outside perspective looking in, but history texts seem to have taken the mention and the experience and the impact of religion out. So I think that that's something that we definitely want to be mindful of. In this example that you see on the screen right now, this was actually provided to us by Morley Balaji, who's on the call with us from the Hindu American Foundation. And what you see is, I want you to just focus on the image, less on the text. This is a page from a textbook. It attempts to discuss the caste system in India. Now, one of the things that we know about the text, which you can't very clearly see, is that it intertwines the examination of religion with culture, so that there's no distinction. There's not really a full vetting and a full presentation of the information. It needs a great deal of context, but what do you notice when you look at the image? What might a student's impression of India be if they're looking at this image in 2015 in their classroom in Pick a Place, America? Just consider that. And then if we look at another example of a visual image of the caste system, it just provides a different starting point without the images, because your students may already have ideas or generalizations, going back to that topic we saw in the earlier part of the webinar, that they may have generalizations about who Indian people are or what Indian culture is. But at least with this image, which I do not endorse or say is completely accurate, this gives a different starting point for a conversation around caste and the people who may be participating in it. It still needs context, but there's a different place and a different possible impression of India that students might have from this image. Now, I want to share with you, I had the opportunity in 2013 to go to Bangalore, India, to present at a conference from our workplace program. And what's interesting is that if you Google Bangalore, India images, these are some of the first images that you see. You see, very well developed country. You see commerce. You see very nice airport, which I thought was very nice. But if we compare these images to, let's go back for a second, to this image, very different starting point about a conversation about Indian people and or caste. So what we're suggesting in this, in terms of choosing appropriate materials, is that you really want to try and balance the images that are being presented in front of young people, in addition to whatever vetting you need to do of the material that's presented before you, that you need to then share with students. Two other points to consider in terms of choosing appropriate materials is letting groups speak for themselves. So one of the things that we know is that there's a great deal of information that any community provides for itself, and has people who are members of that community who speak from their individual experience being a member of that community. So you want to, if you're speaking about Indian people, then you certainly want to have Indian writers and or journalists or commentaries or op-eds. You want to allow people to speak for themselves, as opposed to, as Matt was sharing, having this outside-in perspective. And then also noting that there are experts everywhere. So, there, if you will, there sometimes can be the go-to people or the go-to websites or organizations, and sometimes just because of time, we don't have the time to explore all that we want to. But we really do encourage that you explore YouTube, that you explore blogs and other interactive sources as information to provide and present for students as well, in terms of trying to provide that balanced aspect, or at least being able to show the evolution of people over time. Now, we want to talk a little bit now about adapting and integrating lessons appropriately from this perspective of inclusive curricula and textbooks. Now, let's say that the topic you're discussing is Syrian refugees. Taking a note from our last discussion, you'd want to ask, has anyone ever been to Syria? Now, this starts to begin to speak to our assumptions, because depending on where you are living and working, you might assume that students have never been to the Middle East, that they've never been to Syria, that you don't have any Middle Eastern students in your class. But then that robs the opportunity of finding out or letting students self-identify that they've actually been to another part of the world, or perhaps even a part that you're discussing in your lesson. Um, Being aware of stereotypes becomes really, really critical. We're seeing a lot of, I've seen a lot of news reports recently about responses to immigrants and or refugees in South Africa, in Malta, in the Mediterranean, and a number of places, because there is so much unrest going on in the world. You have literally millions of people looking for different places to be because their homes are under siege or participating in some kind of war effort. So we want to be weary of and aware of stereotypes that may come up. And one of the ways that we distinguish stereotypes at Tanenbaum is that we recognize and acknowledge that we all start from generalizations, that there is a way that's part of the way that the brain works, is that we take in a lot of information and have to categorize it in some way. But what we caution is when generalizations become fixed, when we stop seeking information about it, then those generalizations begin to move more into the world of stereotypes, where it's fixed thinking, there's no opportunity for exploration, and you find either young students or even colleagues unwilling to consider options beyond their own thought. Um, you want to identify, where is Syria, because and what are some of the names that it may have been called? How has it been referenced in religious history, as well as in terms of the history of the developing world? Define what is a refugee, or who is a refugee, and then begin to make space for the related topics of, well, how did power, or either people seeking power, trying to hold on to power, people trying to get power, how does that relate to the situation of the refugee population that you're discussing? Was there force involved that created the situation for refugees, for people to leave their homes? What is the difference between migration and immigration? And having the space for all of these. Now, again, we're providing these as suggestions. We invite you to take from this what bits and pieces make the most sense for you to incorporate into your own lessons, either about this topic or of others. And finally, you want to contextualize. And another way to say this, I think, might be to normalize. Because one of the things that from our behavioral outcomes that we're seeking, that the change that we would like to see, is that religious diversity is something that students just know that there is such a thing, that there is a diversity of experience and practice and belief, but also that there is that being different is normal, and that some of the situations that we find, unfortunately, we have seen before. So the idea of people being refugees is not a new idea. Perhaps the circumstances that they find themselves in, or the circumstances that cause them to be refugees, might be new or unique. So we just encourage you to, when adapting and integrating lessons, consider some of these points in terms of designing your curriculum or delivering curriculum that's been given to you. So let's talk a little bit about the challenging situations that you might experience or be experiencing in your classrooms when religion or religious identity becomes the topic. What you see on the screen now is, sometimes there's a question that we would get in our work a lot of times: how many religions are there? And we always say to the participants that we're working with that it all has to do with who you ask, and also how are you defining religion and how are you defining denominations. So what you see on the screen is just an attempt, and let me just say that the size of the font and the placement of the words and the color of the words have nothing to do with preference on our part. This is really just trying to do some design and a little bit of a design principle. But you can see that this is not even really scratching the surface of all of the various ways that people may identify themselves with a religious experience or a religious tradition. What you also see a little bit of in this slide is the beginnings of the idea of the diversity that exists not just among traditions, but diversity within traditions. And one of the takeaway points that we would want you to remember from this is that it is a fool's errand to try and think that you need to know everything that there is to know about all of these traditions that are on the screen, in addition to anything else, any other traditions that might come up. What we're really looking for, and the best that we can do, is to create a learning environment that practices inclusion and that makes space for the exploration of differences, including religious differences. Something that I wanted to highlight again that we had spoken about once before on our last webinar, there is a lesson that we shared, and we'll share it again at the end of this webinar, that we created called Respecting Each Other. And it has to do with students having agency in a process to define what does respect look like, feel like, and sound like. And their responses basically become the foundation of a class contract or agreement in the ways in which students will interact with one another. And going back to this, reinforcing this kind of class contract or agreement on a daily basis actually provides that context for difficult conversations, because we're not suggesting that talking about religion is any less difficult than talking about any other identifiers like race or first language or ethnicity or sexual orientation. But what we can do is manage the environment rather than trying to manage what students believe, because their religious beliefs are theirs, they are personal, they are entitled to them. But what we want to manage is the ways in which young people interact and speak with each other when these topics come up. One way to think about how to handle challenging conversations is to ask yourself in a situation, is what's going on or are the interactions with students an actionable moment versus a teachable moment? Another kind of guidepost, if you will, is to consider whether the statements of a student, is their innocence, what is the intention of the student's comments, and what is the impact of the student's comments, because those are the things that you want to either evaluate or manage. What is the level of innocence of their comments, meaning that they really are not intending harm, but that is the best language that they have at the moment. And then how to deal with the impact of their statements regardless of their intention. And then finally, I'll share with you in a moment what Give Me a Hammer is all about. So let's start with a case study. Let's use this case study as a way to kind of think through some of this. So in this case study, 40 students in your school sneak onto school property to participate in a late night game called Beat the Jew. The game involves blindfolding Jews, meaning students, taking them by car off the school campus and leaving them somewhere. They are instructed to find their way back to base, to the school, while they are pursued by Nazis. Participants for this game are gathered by using social media like Facebook. Now, the students are going to be disciplined, but what else is there to do? So we'd like for you to consider and use your chat feature, use the chat box. How could you leverage this situation as a teachable moment? Because clearly what has gone on is an actionable moment. And this case study was actually taken from an actual circumstance that happened in a school in California. And so there were actions taken, students were held to account. There was training provided to the faculty and to the staff. But how do you leverage this as a teachable moment? How do you have this become an action that can actually inform what goes on in your classroom? hmm So perhaps a service learning or a service learning opportunity could come out of this. Being able to perhaps have a Holocaust survivor come into the school to speak, or a trip to, or yeah, a trip to the Holocaust Museum, or actually not a trip, but actually accessing the Holocaust Museum videos. Yes. So considering this a school-wide concern, a school-wide problem, addressing it directly with your classes, with your students, helping them understand the nature of the Holocaust. And thank you so much for sharing that, Murray, because one of the things that we saw in the reporting of the incident was that the students, many of the students, really had no emotional relationship to the idea of who Jewish people were or what the Holocaust really was about. Absolutely. And Aaron, what you're sharing in terms of discussing the Nazis, the persecution of European Jews, and one of the things that somebody might be typing at this particular moment is that if, God forbid, that this instance had happened recently, there is a perfect opportunity to actually talk about the rising anti Semitism that we see going on in Europe and in other places around the world. And what are some of the causes? Are the causes the same? Are we seeing some of the same kinds of conditions, or at least people's experiences of the same kinds of conditions that preceded the Holocaust and the annihilation of 6 million people? Yes, and so, here's another way. And I think the other thing too is that, some of the things that we've been sharing from our perspective at Tannenbaum really can sometimes become a shared teaching experience. If there's a colleague that you have who works in another discipline, that it might be working with a language arts or English teacher who could cover the Scopes trial while you actually talk about some of the more historical background, that kind of thing. Physical anthropology had a great deal to do with the ideas that were perpetrated around the Holocaust. So yes, thank you for sharing that. Just to move on in terms of things that you can model in the classroom, and it really does have to do with some of your students, depending on their age, depending on the age that you're teaching. And I've seen this be the case from my own experience. I taught high school for 11 years here in New York City. And, when you have students a couple of times, they begin to speak like you and respond like you. Um, One of the things that you can always do is to reference, if you have rules of respect or a classroom contract or agreement, to constantly reinforce that. So, and it's great because the students have created it. So ultimately, they can kind of take that on and be managing each other rather than you having to manage them. Asking questions, just asking follow-up questions like, what did you want to know? When someone says something that occurs like it was inappropriate, or it might have even been, it might occur as negative, you could actually kind of stop the question by asking, what did you want to know? What were you trying to find out? And also having students be aware of their impact regardless of their intention. So if their intention was not to harm anyone, but they asked a question and you can physically see someone have a reaction, did you notice that? Did you notice the response that your colleague had, your peer had to the question? Can you ask the question again? Is there another way you can ask the same question? Did you want to know something? And or what did you want to know? What are you trying to find out? Because again, students use the language that they have, and we have to provide the models for them to ask different questions or deeper questions. And really, the basic questions can be the most respectful questions. When, where, why, who, how, what, and questions, follow-up questions like, can you tell me more about what you mean? As opposed to, you're stupid, or things like that. But we really want to encourage young people to ask more probing questions. And part of that has to do with how safe they feel in the environment. So we want to create that safe space and an inclusive learning environment where young people are encouraged to ask about what they don't know about and not to rely on stereotypes, to use their generalizations as a starting point for deeper knowledge and deeper learning. So we're moving into the section on teaching about religion, and what we hope to share in this section are some suggestions on things that you might consider in terms of including or new starting or new jumping off points for discussions within your content areas. And we're going to start with a video. Okay, so here we go.
We establish no religion in this country. We command no worship. We mandate no belief, nor will we ever. Church and state are and must remain separate.
They who can give up essential liberty to obtain a little temporary safety deserve neither liberty nor safety.
believe in an America that is officially neither Catholic, Protestant, nor Jewish, for while this year it may be a Catholic against whom the finger of suspicion is pointed, in other years it has been, and may someday be again, a Jew, or a Quaker, or a Unitarian, or a Baptist.
I also want to speak tonight directly to Muslims throughout the world. We respect your faith. It's practiced freely by many millions of Americans and by millions more in countries that America counts as friends. Its teachings are good and peaceful, and those who commit evil in the name of Allah blaspheme the name of Allah.
At the same time that our Constitution prohibits state establishment of religion, it protects the free exercise of all religions. And government should not make it more difficult for Christians, Jews, Muslims, or other believing people to practice their faith.
We are a nation of Christians and Muslims, Jews and Hindus, and non-believers. We are shaped by every language and culture, drawn from every end of this earth, and we cannot help but believe that the old hatreds shall someday pass.
The great thing about America is that you should be allowed to worship any way you want. And if you choose not to worship, you're equally as patriotic as somebody who does worship. And if you choose to worship, you're equally American if you're a Christian, a Jew, a Muslim. And that's the wonderful thing about our country, and that's the way it should be.
The video was created as part of a coalition of organizations, both faith-based and secular, here in New York City that we called ourselves Prepare New York. And some of you may remember in 2010 when what was known as the Ground Zero Mosque became the large controversy. Over the course of that summer and that fall, there were a great number of hate crime incidents that took place, and we were all very concerned about what might happen during the 10th anniversary of 9/11. So we all kind of leaned into what our unique capabilities were, and one of our partners spearheaded the creation of this video called We the People. there are a number, we have actually on our website a number of fact sheets and conversation starters and conversation guides that can be used in classrooms and with colleagues and in communities. But this video, if you will, is an interesting way to look at the experience and the dynamism of religion from a historical and social studies context within the United States experience. And I think one of the things that I love about the video is that it reminds us of experiences of people and religious groups in particular who are part of the mainstream today, but at some moment in time were designated as undesirable or even subjected to death and horrible circumstances. So we hope that that is useful, and it is, free to use. Please use it as you will. We'd also all love to know how you might use something like that, or like how you might use this video. Another possibility, another suggestion is looking at the moments. We talked a little bit in the last webinar about the idea of citizenship, and in particular global citizenship as a framework for talking about including religion and religious identity in the context of working with students around them being global citizens and what some of that meant. But one of the things that you might consider from this perspective is looking to see within your curriculum, within something that you're already doing, where the identity of a citizen and that citizen's religious identity can be explored. So the video actually hearkened a little bit to this. The idea of the Native American use of peyote was outlawed for hundreds of years. And it was only originally enacted in 1978, and then stronger legislation came in 1993 that allowed for Native Americans to use peyote as part of religious practice. The interesting thing to consider, or perhaps research topic or something to explore with students, what happened before 1978? So what was the experience of being Native American and literally having one of your religious practices be outlawed in the country in which you live? So that may be something worth exploring with students. I know that this is hard to see, but we will be sending you a full-size version of this. This is something that we created. This is what we call a holiday inclusion and planning template. We created this in a webinar series that we did with Teaching Tolerance on the December Dilemma. And that webinar is actually on our website and on Teaching Tolerance's website. You can look at that for, it's a free resource. But what we tried to do was to give a framework for thinking about holidays from a year-round perspective, as opposed to kind of like just dealing with what happens in December. So if you were to like think through the holidays that naturally occur in the school's calendar, that you have Diwali an example, that what are the dates this year? What are the religions that could be discussed in relationship to Diwali? What are the things that you want to know or students might want to know? What are some of the traditions that you could introduce or discuss? What is the potential relevance to your students? Again, thinking about what are, from that adapting and integrating lessons appropriately, what's the relevance to your students as people in addition to the subject matter that you're going through? And then what are the topics that are already addressed in your curriculum at that time in the year? Or what link could you make? So maybe you could make a link to Indian immigration to the United States to content that you're already discussing. And then what are some of the school-wide events that are taking place that you could address or add into this particular topic? So in terms of lesson planning, this is not meant to be like, do it this way, but this is just a way to think about how you might incorporate both the 7 principles and the conversation around religion and religious identity into your own classes. So your teaching point might have to do with promoting social justice, so that the teaching point, our principle around promoting social justice, has everything to do with students coming to the understanding that what's fair for the group is more important than what's fair for them as an individual. that there's a moment to consider what standards you're addressing, whether they're Common Core standards, National Council of Social Studies standards, English language arts standards, etc. In the Do Now is an opportunity for practicing the principle of teaching all students, where you have students able to participate from a number of modalities in the beginning of the lesson. That there may be a kinesthetic way to answer the question, or there may be a spoken way, or something that involves audio, or something along those lines, that there are a number of ways for students to access the information. That the mini lesson can be an opportunity for adapting and integrating lessons appropriately. And you see it in the last point, but it's applicable here in terms of differentiating the lesson. Independent and or group practice allows for students, or can allow for students, to share different aspects of themselves. So when we talk about exploring multiple identities, we mean that all students have a variety of ways in which they identify themselves, and in that independent and group practice experience is an opportunity for students to both explore and or share with their peers different aspects of themselves. The summary is another opportunity for introducing a variety of modalities in terms of what do students remember, what do they understand about the lesson that you've just presented. The homework is also about choosing appropriate materials, about what is the best way for students to show that they understand the material and can even refashion the material and the information that you've given them. And then the assessment. So how you actually assess all of this has everything to do with promoting social justice from the perspective of differentiation, that everyone may not be able to test or show competency in the same way, but that it is important that everyone have a fair opportunity to do that. So there's another handout that we'll be sending you that tries to chronicle a number of historical events that are impacted or whose actors are religious people, or religion is impacting that moment. So I've just highlighted a few of them here. In 1654, Jews of Portuguese background arrive in Dutch New York. And that would be one of those things that most people would not think of. Most people think about the Jewish experience with the United States starting escaping Eastern Europe with the Holocaust. 1730, Ayuba Suleiman Diallo, one of the first Muslims brought to America as a slave. So the whole experience of, there's a lot that's discussed in terms of the African slave trade, but often the idea that many of the slaves that were brought over actually were practicing Islam at the time of their capture. And part of the assimilation and the degradation of slavery in the United States was the stripping away of Islam from African slaves. The U.S. Naturalization Act grants citizenship only to free white persons in 1790. 1853, the first Buddhist temple is built. 1868, the 14th Amendment grants equal protection under the law to all residents. Then the 1924 Immigration Act establishes quotas to prevent immigration from Eastern and Southern Europe and Asia, noting that this is in between the First World War and the Second World War. 1961, the Supreme Court rules that states cannot prevent atheists from holding public office. But you noticed in that video that there is still this experience of atheists as the most untrustworthy people. So, and that almost everyone who has run for president has had to in some way prove that they either are or are not a person of faith. More instances, they're trying to prove that they are. 1965, the immigration quotas are removed, and that was led to much of the great diversity that we experience in the country today. And then 1993, the Religious Freedom Restoration Act is passed, which became the foundation for many arguments that are going on in the Supreme Court today. So again, these are just kind of just quick historical moments that you might consider incorporating in some way that might give more context and some texture to the work that you're already doing. So as we move to conclusion, let me just ask, are there any historical moments that you currently use or could use to teach about religion to your students? So could you just take a moment and share with us in the chat box, what are some of the historical moments that you currently use or could use to teach about religion to your students? Okay, the Civil Rights Movement, thank you. Okay, the Crusades. Okay, any others? We have the Civil Rights Movement, the Crusades, any other historical moments that you either are already using or you could incorporate to teach about religion to your students? So Mary is saying, from being from Indiana, we have excellent current events, the recent passage and then the hurried amendments to the state religious freedom legislation. Absolutely. And I'm sure it's come up in class. So as we're moving towards concluding for tonight and concluding these series, a few things that we'd like to ask you to remember when choosing or creating curriculum and then choosing books. Be as diverse as you possibly can and consider your audience. And even if your students occur as a homogeneous group of students, there is diversity within them. And so we want to provide as many opportunities for them to find themselves in the work that we're presenting. You do not have to know everything about religion in order to teach about religion. What there really is for you to focus on is managing the behavior of students, managing the environment, creating that safe, inclusive learning environment for them to inquire with one another in a respectful way. You do not have to manage what they believe, and you do not have to manage what their parents believe. And then finally, that history is rich with opportunities to talk about the impact of religion on society. So just mine for the gold. You may not be able to do all that you would like to do, but certainly continue looking for those opportunities where the impact of religion or religious identity in the content that you're discussing can be made available to students for consideration. Unfortunately, we do not have any time tonight for questions, but if you do have questions, you can certainly take a moment and add them into our chat box. And on behalf of my colleagues at the Hindu American Foundation, at Face to Faith, the Tony Blair Faith Foundation, National Council for the Social Studies, and the Religious Freedom Center, the Museum Project, we want to thank all of you for your participation tonight and in this series. And please reach out to us if we can be helpful to you.